behalf of the Iowa State University Committee on Lectures and the Anthropology Club, it's my pleasure to introduce to you this evening Dr. Richard Klein from the University of Chicago, who has come here to talk to us about the ecology of early man in southern Africa. Dr. Klein has done archaeological work in a number of different areas of the world, including the Soviet Union, where he did his dissertation research. More recently, he has worked for several years in the Republic of South Africa, where he has concerned himself with, essentially with the food debris produced by human beings living many, many centuries and millennia ago, and the interpretation of this food debris in terms of the relationships between human beings and their environment. Well, I think that without further ado, I will just ask Dr. Klein to carry on with his talk.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think that what I would probably be best at doing tonight is to give you some idea of the kind of research I've been involved in over the past 7 or 8 years, very much in the kind of vein that Dr. Bauer suggested. Mainly what I look at are animal bones, try and understand as much as I can about the past, particularly about the way in which people interacted with animals from these bones. And what I've done is to bring a bunch of slides, and I thought that perhaps many of you, probably most of you, have not seen this part of the world, to give you a bit of a feeling for what the countryside looks like, and perhaps at the same time then a general idea of how prehistoric people living in this area, Stone Age people, utilized that countryside, and more particularly the animal resources the countryside had to offer. So I'm going to turn, I think I'll ask for the slides right away. Let me, well, let's take a look at the first one, which is a map, because that's the first thing to take care of, tell you something about the geography. I think we're going to, there are Kodachromes here, and I think we'll need the lights out that shine on the screen as well. Is that possible? Wait a second, what about, is that the screen?
That's the screen, Richard, yeah.
All right, well, maybe wait while Mr. Bauer looks to see what he can do about the lights. This is obviously an outline map of Africa. I would prefer to have had one that was more detailed as far as southern Africa was concerned, because it's southern Africa I'm going to talk about, but at least I can point out on this map the area that I'm concerned with. Can you focus that a bit? Unfortunately, the area that's blocked off here is East Africa, or more particularly that part of East Africa which has proved to be so exciting in recent years in providing human remains of great antiquity, hominid remains, hominids being the technical term for human beings, going back perhaps as much as 14 or 15 million years, and certainly back to at least 5 or 6. Now, in recent years, because of the very important, spectacular, interesting discoveries that have been made in East Africa, more or less in the area blocked out on the map, southern Africa has kind of gone into eclipse in a sense. Most people aren't aware that research on early man continues in southern Africa, and yet it was in southern Africa that the whole thing began. The first man-apes, or Australopithecines, which I'm sure many people have heard of, what are today the oldest well-documented ancestral humans, were found in South Africa in the 1920s. More particularly, they were found at this site down here called Tom. And then subsequently in South Africa in the 1930s and 1940s, a series of other sites were discovered from which these man-apes or Australopithecines were recovered as fossils. One of the difficulties in South Africa was for a very long time trying to get an idea of how old these man-apes were in geological terms. And it wasn't until work began in East Africa where it's possible to actually date rocks through geochemical, geophysical means that we became aware of just how old these man-ape fossils were. We can compare, we can establish in southern Africa, these are the southern African sites down here that have provided the man-apes, or Australopithecines. We can compare the animal remains that come out of the same sites with animal remains that come from East Africa, where we have actual dates in years, at least broadly speaking in years, and therefore get an idea of how old these southern African sites are, even though we can't get the same kinds of dates in southern Africa. The man-apes in southern Africa appear, on the basis of this kind of comparison, to be between roughly 1 and 3 million years old. All right. Well, I'm going to turn to the next slide in a moment. This is basically the area I'll be talking about, south of about a line that I'm drawing there with my hand. That's southern Africa. In addition to the man-apes in southern Africa, we have a very rich archaeological record, and also to some extent a biological record, a record of the evolution of the human organism as a biological being following the man-apes after 1 million years ago. Now here's the problem with the lights. If we,
Can't find a switch.
I wonder,
There's one over here which says off.
well,
Is there a room back there in the corner? I think this happened once before.
well, let me continue talking about, I can perhaps give you some background information, and if we can get the lights off, then we'll be able to look at the slides then. I mentioned a moment ago that in East Africa we have fossils that can be called human in the very broadest sense, belonging to the zoological family Hominidae, which is the zoologist's technical term for human beings, going back perhaps as much as 12 or 14 million years. If you studied a bit of anthropology, you've heard of these fossils. They're referred to as Ramapithecus. Originally, Louis Leakey referred to the East African ones as Kennypithecus, but they're now regarded by most biological anthropologists and human paleontologists, primate paleontologists, as the same as things that were found in India and were initially called Ramapithecus. And in East Africa, things like that have been well dated to roughly 12 to 14 million years ago. Now, in that same time range in southern Africa, we have very, very few sites that have provided fossils of any kind. Obviously, you've got to have a site with bones in some kind of general sense before you can expect to find human ancestors at the site. And sites like that, as I say, are very rare in southern Africa. We only have one so far. I could have shown you on the map a moment ago, but it's not all that vital. It's in the part of southern Africa that's called Southwest Africa by the South Africans and Namibia by most of the rest of the world. And so far, the amount of bone that's come from it is very small, and there are no ancestral human beings from the site. It's only when we move upwards in time, to the time of the man-apes, or Australopithecines of Africa, to 1 to 3 million years ago, that period of time between 1 and 3 million years ago, that the record picks up and that we begin to get some notion in southern Africa of human evolution. However, there's a site not very far from Cape Town that dates to about 4 to 5 million years ago. Oh, there we go, great. Swell. There's a site located about 80 miles north of Cape Town in the extreme southwestern tip of Africa called Langevan Vec. And I see some people trying to write things down. Maybe I can spell that for you later. It's an Afrikaans word. With a fauna, that is with animal bones, that we know on the basis of East African comparisons must be about 4 to 5 million years old. And it's interesting, not because it has man-apes, but because it doesn't. And I'd like to elaborate on that. A couple, I think, very interesting points that this site has provided by not having given us the bones of man-apes. This is the site. It's a vast open-air phosphate quarry. The bones come off the floor. The overlying deposits are being mined for phosphate, which is used for fertilizer. And the fossils were discovered in the process of this mining. In fact, it's probably true that worldwide, most early man sites are discovered in the context of economic or commercial activity rather than by deliberate searches by archaeologists or paleontologists. And this site is, in that sense, part of the rule rather than an exception. It was found by people who were, they recognized fossils in the process of doing this phosphate mining. The fossils come off the bottom of the quarry. Down here, fortunately, they are concentrated below the level of the phosphate. Have the next slide. Now, I've already said this site is some 4 to 5 million years old, or the bones of the site are some 4 to 5 million years old. And the animals that are involved are very interesting ones. There are penguins and seals, very much as there are on the coast today, only about 10 miles away. However, the species that are involved are very different. This seal, in fact, reconstructed here, is very similar to the seal that lives in the Mediterranean today, rather than to the seal which lives off the coast of South Africa right now, which is an indication of the great antiquity of the site. Now, the next slide. These are all a series of reconstructions. Here you're looking at something else which perhaps can give you an idea of the great antiquity of this site. These animals here are bears. And so far, these are the only bears that have ever been discovered in Africa. And here they are right at the southern tip of Africa, as far down south in Africa as you can possibly get. Again, this is, in some sense, a measure of the antiquity of the site. 4 to 5 million years ago, things were very different in Africa than they are today. And then there's some other animals depicted for you here. These are 3-toed horses, rather archaic kinds of horses, very different from the modern ones. Some more back there. Some strange-looking antelopes. These antelopes, in fact, that are drawn there are much more like antelopes that live in India today than like antelopes that live in Africa. And in fact, if you go back 4 or 5 million years ago, there were connections of sorts, faunal connections, animal connections, to Eurasia. And they're very, very clear-cut in Africa 4 to 5 million years ago. Have the next slide, please. Now here, again, another reconstruction. You see some of the strange animals. This is a saber-toothed cat. Back here is an animal that's related to giraffes, but had a rather short neck and a kind of ox-like body and these antlers. Lived in this area about 4 to 5 million years ago. Here are a bunch of strange hyena-like animals. They were ancestral hyenas feeding off a carcass, and some ostrich-like animals in the background, and some hippo, or I'm not quite sure what those are supposed to be. I think those are supposed to be pigs there. There were hippos there as well, but the animals back there. The next slide, please. Again, another reconstruction. Here, very definitely a pig. This pig, in fact, is very interesting. It was the size of a rhinoceros. That pig is a very useful animal at the site because the same animal, the same species, or at least the same genus, same general kind of thing, is represented in East Africa, and it's one of the ways that we can get an idea of how old this site is, because presumably it existed in the two places at about the same time, 4 to 5 million years ago. See a more or less modern giraffe there, some other strange sorts of antelopes in here, an ancestral rhinoceros, not too different from the living white rhinoceros, and some ancestral elephants there. They are also very useful for getting an idea of how old the site is. You can see that the environment that's been reconstructed from the animal bones and also from plant remains and so forth that we have is a kind of floodplain with a river meandering down and very near the coast. The coast is just off there. And you saw it before, a reconstruction of the coast with seals and penguins. Have the next slide, please. This should be the last one, at least in this series. Here you have a kind of a thing like a big genet cat, a strange kind of animal that I suppose the closest parallel in the Americas would be to a thing like a weasel or a mink, only this was an enormous animal, several times the size. Here there's a giant otter, which is very interesting, because it's very, very similar to things that lived in Europe 4 to 5 million years ago. Again, gives you an idea that 4 to 5 million years ago, Africa was very different than it is today, and in some ways, the fauna was more like a European fauna. Now, I mentioned that one of the things that's missing at this site are bones of the man-apes, the Australopithecines of Africa. In East Africa, in this 4 to 5 million year time range, we have them. There are some sites southwest of Lake Rudolph, or what's now called in Kenya Lake Turkana, where these things are represented. Why aren't they present here? Well, one thing you might say is that perhaps we don't have enough bones from this site. Maybe there are more from East Africa. Well, that one I can rule out immediately. The accumulated bones from this particular site, the number of bones that are involved, the total volume of the collection, is several times that of all the like-age East African sites put together. All the East African sites in the 4 to 5 million year range, if you took all their bones and put them in one place, they wouldn't compare to the size of the collection from this site. Now, one of the reasons why the number of bones from this site is so large is because it is very close to Cape Town, a major metropolitan center, and it's on a paved road. It's very easy to get them out of the ground and back to Cape Town. And the collection is simply enormous. So the absence of human bones in the very broad sense, man-ape bones from this site, is not a matter of small sample size, not a matter of not having collected enough. I think the answer, the reason that there aren't man-ape bones in the site is because the man-apes weren't there. And that becomes interesting in several respects. First of all, you ask yourself, well, how could that happen? Well, we're a long way south of the equator here. All the East African sites that have provided human remains in this general time range, 4 to 5 million years ago, or even as recently as 2 to 3 million years ago, are very close to the equator, within just a few degrees either side. Here we're 32 degrees south. We're in fact in temperate latitudes. We're in an area today where it can snow, at least in wintertime. And in fact, the kind of weather we're having outside right now is not at all unknown in this region right now in their winter, which is the mirror image of ours, comes in July and August. And it was even fairly chilly, perhaps, in the time period that we're talking about here, 4 to 5 million years ago. In any case, there were areas in between, areas of fairly substantial height, altitudinal height, which might have been very difficult for these man-apes to pass through. And I think that what we're looking at here, and we don't find them, the man-apes in deposits 4 to 5 million years ago this far south, what we're looking at is their inability, both in perhaps biological terms and in cultural terms, to penetrate so far south of the equator. Now, there's another very interesting thing about this site. Assuming now that I'm correct and that the people in the very broad sense, man-apes, weren't represented here. You look at these animals here, and there's another one down here, a thing that's sort of like a mongoose, was a kind of ancestral mongoose. And I showed you bears before, I showed you saber-toothed cats and hyenas. It's a very interesting thing that at the site, there's a very high proportion of the bones which are carnivore bones. In fact, far more than you would ever find if you were just to, suppose you were to go out to a modern African environment today and start killing animals random. You wouldn't get anywhere near as many carnivores as you get out of this site. Carnivores are very much overrepresented. Not just in terms of numbers of individual carnivores, but in terms of the different numbers of different kinds of carnivores. Lots and lots of different kinds. For example, let's take the hyenas. There's no modern African environment today where you can find more than 2 hyenas together, 2 kinds of hyenas together. In this part of the world, you'll have the spotted hyena and the brown hyena. Same thing in East Africa. You move a little bit further north, and you get the spotted hyena and the striped hyena, but you never find more than 2 together in any given environment. Here we have at least 5 different kinds of hyenas. In terms of cats, there are 5 or 6 different kinds of cats, reasonably good-sized cats. They're very diverse fauna of carnivores. And that's a very interesting thing, because as I say, it's very different from the modern situation in any part of Africa. And what strikes me, what I think is involved here, I think we're looking at what an African fauna looked like before people appeared on the scene. Because what are people in essence? People are, although we're classified in another zoological order than the carnivores, we live a very similar way of life in lots of respects, and in particular we're meat eaters. And when people entered the meat-eating niche in a big way, when people became meat eaters in an important fashion, somebody had to lose, and it was carnivores. And I say in this area, I think that in this 4 to 5 million year time period, there were no people present, and that's what accounts for, in a sense, for the great diversity of carnivores. Or putting it perhaps more precisely, when you move upwards in time, to perhaps just 1 million or 2 million years ago in this area, the diversity of carnivores is about the same as it is today, and we know then there were people present. And somewhere between 1 million years ago, let's say, and 5 million years ago, people appeared in the area, and after their appearance, the carnivores suffered because people were very successful at meat eating, and somebody, as I say, had to, the energy that went into people went out of carnivores in a sense. At least I think that must be part of the reason for the decline in carnivores after 4 to 5 million years ago. It might be possible in East Africa to do something with this in a harder fashion. In East Africa, they have a continuous sequence of fossiliferous deposits providing carnivore and other bones, beginning at least 5 million years ago and continuing on upwards, well, virtually to the present. Unfortunately, the kinds of samples that they have in most places of animal bones don't allow you to make good counts. You never know whether you're dealing with the presence or absence sort of situation because of small sample size or because of collecting bias. They don't necessarily collect everything in the same way that we do at this site. Partly that's a logistical problem. They can't necessarily pick up everything and take it home. They can only collect certain sorts of things in terms of the available transport back to Nairobi or whatever. But partly it's a matter of research problem too, not necessarily asking that question. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Now, this is, I've tried to stick in a bunch of maps here because I know that one problem that I would have faced several years ago before I went to Southern Africa was the geography. Now, the site that we were just looking at, or the reconstructions really, Langebaan is right in here. Here's Cape Town down here. Cape Town is at about 34 degrees south. Langebaan must be at about 33, I would guess, right about in here, somewhere like that. The Australopithecine sites, the Nanabe sites in South Africa, well, the Tong site isn't on here, but it would be right about here. Then there are 3 very important sites located very near Johannesburg called Swartkrans, Kroondraai, and Sterkfontein, and another one about 150 miles north of Johannesburg called Makapan's Kap. You see it up there. They say the human remains, the Australopithecine remains from these sites, all date to between about 1 and 3 million years ago. I think I can say that with some security. In fact, I'm prepared to say that some of them are closer to 3 million years and some are closer to 1, although not all my colleagues would think you could be so precise, but I believe it's possible now. Anyway, one of the outstanding problems with these sites, and I think some of you who've studied this will be aware of this problem, is that the sites themselves were, at the time the bones got there, deep underground caverns. They weren't caves. You see them referred to as the Australopithecine caves of Southern Africa. Well, they weren't caves in the kind of sense that we often think of caves. You couldn't walk into them horizontally. There were long shafts leading down to deep underground caverns. And there's a problem with trying to understand how the bones got into those caverns. They obviously fell in or were washed in. They weren't carried there by any terrestrial vertebrate. They weren't carried there by, certainly by people. They weren't carried there by any other kind of carnivore. But then how did they get there? Well, something accumulated them around the mouth of this shaft leading down into the ground. And there's been an argument going on for many, many years about whether the accumulator were the man-apes, who are of course represented among the bones themselves, or another large meat-eating animal. And that's the next thing I'd like to talk about. Okay, here you're looking at the countryside as it stands today. You're standing at one of these man-ape sites, the site of Sterkfontein, which is probably closer to 3 million years, and looking toward another one over there, the site of Swartkrans, which is probably, you can't actually see the site, and you'll see why in a moment. You're just looking at the area, the piece of rock, let's say, in which the site is located. That site is probably closer to 1 million years. One of the things about these sites today is that there's been an enormous amount of erosion in the area. You have these deep underground caverns that were forming 1 to 3 million years ago with all these bones in them. At that time, they say they were very much underground. The shafts that led down to them may have been as much as 100 feet long. But then there's been erosion in the meanwhile. The shafts are completely gone, and the filling, the bones that filled in, the bones and dirt and whatever that filled the underground cavities are now exposed at the surface because the overlying hillside has been eroded away. And that's what you find, these pockets of bone which are filling ancient caves, and you don't actually see the caves at all anymore. All right. Well, the countryside, as you can see today, is rather open. Actually, the vegetation has obviously been affected by long human occupation, particularly in recent times, a lot of agriculture, but there have never been a whole lot of trees. In fact, the trees that you're looking at here are all probably European trees recently planted. And that's an important point in terms of something I'm going to say in a moment. It was also an important point, incidentally, and I'm sure many of you know this already, in identifying the man-apes as human beings in some broad sense. Raymond Dard, who first discovered these things in the mid-1920s, pointed out that if you had something that looked sort of human living in an area like this, it couldn't have been living in trees, and therefore it would more likely to be related to people in some sense than to the apes, although on just the skull, which he discovered first, there was some argument about whether it was a person, people in the broad sense, or an ape. And he was using ecological data, environmental data, the suggestion that in this part of the world, it'd be very unlikely to have apes because there is no evidence that there were ever any kind of forest. He used that as an argument that the skull, which some people thought was an ape, was more likely to be a person. Anyway, I don't want to get into that in any detail. Have the next slide, please. Here you're looking into the site of Swartkrans, and it looks like a cave now because the archaeologists and others have been in there and have emptied it out, in a sense. But it didn't look like this at the time of discovery. At the time of discovery, where the people were standing, was just full of dirt and bone, all glued together in a hard kind of rock called breccia, much of which was removed. These sites, incidentally, like the Longabon Beck site that I showed you a little while ago, the 4 to 5 million year old site, were discovered largely through commercial activity. In the deposit that filled the cave, in addition to the bones and so forth, there were bands of pure white lime called travertine, which again you can use for fertilizer, you can use for toothpaste, and any number of other things. And this was mined commercially. And it's in that process that the sites were discovered. Only later did archaeologists and paleontologists go in there and begin working these things in some kind of scientific fashion. Here you're looking at an excursion of the South African Quaternary Association to the site of Swartkrans in 1973. Next slide, please. One of the problems with these sites is that the bones are all sort of glued together in a kind of dirty matrix. And this is a machine for getting bones out. You put a bit of the block, you put a bit of the rock that has bones in it between these two chisel bits, and then you screw them together and they crack it. Hopefully they crack around the bones rather than through them, but it doesn't always work that way. Now, I mentioned before that one of the problems that has plagued anthropology, that anthropologists have been intrigued by for many years, is how do the bones get into these sites? Well, Raymond Dart, whose name I mentioned a moment ago, and who was responsible for the discovery of the first Australopithecines, has maintained for many years that it was the Australopithecines, the man-apes, who brought the bones back to the sites and accumulated them, presumably now, if he were talking about this, he would say around the mouths of these shafts, and then some of the bones funneled down into the underground caverns. Other people, and I suppose right now I'm very much in this camp, have suggested that the man-apes were not bringing bones back themselves, but were getting the man-ape bones and the bones of other animals were being brought back by other carnivores, particularly leopards and hyenas. Now the leopard thing is a very interesting possibility. The person who suggested this most strongly has been C.K. Brame at the Transvaal Museum in Pretoria. And you remember a moment ago I was talking about trees being very rare in this environment. It's a grassy sort of plain. Where you find trees, however, at least in natural circumstances, as opposed to trees that have been recently planted and irrigated by modern people, where you find trees in natural situations here, it's generally at the mouths of one of these underground caverns. The trees send their roots down in the underground cavern. There generally be water below, and there's also some amount of shelter provided in situations like this. Moisture and shelter being the two prerequisites for getting trees in this kind of situation. Now, the modern leopard, and this has been observed in many parts of Africa, has a problem after it's made a kill. Leopards have a problem in keeping their kills from other carnivores, particularly from hyenas, which will mob a leopard and chase it off its kill, or lions will sometimes do the same thing. And the leopard's response to that problem is often to take an animal, quite a large one, even things that weigh nearly as much or sometimes as much as leopards. They will drive them long distances, hundreds of yards, sometimes more than a mile, and then up into a tree where they're relatively safe, certainly from hyenas and most of the time from lions. Then they eat the animal, they eat their kill in the tree, and the bones fall out. And if there were, in fact, if trees were largely limited to the mouths of these underground shafts, then of course that would be a good source for the bones, wouldn't it, in these underground shafts. And Brain has argued very cogently that for Swartkrans and Sterkfontein, two of these Australopithecine sites, that's the source of the bones. And he actually has, I'm sorry, I forgot to bring a slide of it because I have one, but he actually has a piece of Australopithecine skull, a man-ape skull, with two depressions in it that are exactly the same breadth apart as the canines, the eye teeth, of a leopard. And the leopard that lived there at the time was very similar to, that is 1 to 3 million years ago, was very similar to the leopard that's living today. And I think his case is a very good one. Now, there's another site that I had on the map a moment ago that's about 150 miles north of the sites we've just been talking about, the site of Makapan Scott. Raymond Dart, who still maintains that the bones, in fact, were brought to all the sites by the Australopithecines, was particularly interested in this site of Makapan Scott. He had an assistant who did a study of the animal bones from this site of Makapan Scott. Makapan Scott, incidentally, it's an interesting word or name. Makapan was a famous African chief in this area. Khat, G-A-T, in Afrikaans simply means cave. And Makapan led his people into this cave, or into a cave actually, not the one that the Australopithecine bones were found in, but one nearby. And in a fight against the Afrikaners, Boers, many, many years ago, and he and his people died there, and so the area became known as Makapan Scott. Anyway, Dart had one of his assistants study the animal bones from the Makapan Scott site. Can I have the next slide, please? Here's the Makapan Valley, very near where the site is. You see all this whitish stuff. That's all lime, because the Makapan site, the Makapan Scott site, like the other sites that we've been talking about were all discovered in the process of commercial lime mining. Anyway, in the study of the animal bones from the site, his assistant discovered that the animals were represented by all their body parts, but in very strange proportions. For example, the lower arm bone, what we know technically as the distal humerus, the bone that makes up the upper part of the elbow, the lower arm bone, was very common for the antelopes. It was antelopes that they looked at in most detail. Antelopes are the most common animals in all African sites. This bone was very common. The upper arm bone, the upper half, I should say, of the arm, the proximal humerus, was very uncommon for the antelopes. And there were a lot of other discrepancies like this. Wrist bones were practically absent. Wrist and ankle bones were practically absent. On the other hand, the far end of the shin bone was very common. And there were all these strange discrepancies. Some bones were much better represented than you would have expected. Other bones were much more poorly represented. And Dart thought this was evidence that the Australopithecines were selecting some bones for tools and neglecting others that weren't useful as tools. Also, there were fractures. Can I have the next slide, please? Here are some of the bones from Makapanskat. You see, here's a bit of broken bone, and there's another bit of broken bone stuck into the hollow inside of the first bit. And the fractures, the way in which they're broken, Dart thought that those kinds of breaks could only occur if people were involved. He didn't think carnivores could do that. Plus the strange juxtaposition, two bones stuck into one another. There were also some bones, and you're looking at others here. This is a complete foot of a horse, or I should say a toe. All three phalanges, all three toe bones in order. And somehow Dart thought that that must be the kind of thing that people would do. He thought that carnivores would have torn all the bones apart. They would never allow bones that were next to each other to stay together. Finding them together like this must mean that the flesh was still on when they were introduced to the site. And Dart didn't think that carnivores would allow that. He thought they would have torn them to bits. There were other things that Dart thought were important in indicating that these bones had been brought here by people rather than by carnivores. There were some baboon skulls from this site and from others, and even some of the Manape skulls, which had strange depressions, like they'd been hit over the head with a club or something like this. And Dart thought that's what was involved, that the Australopithecines were beating on each other and on baboons. And all this evidence taken together, the strange proportions of the body parts, the nature of the breaks of the bones, bones jammed into bones, bones that were still in anatomical order as they are here, the bashed baboon and Manape skulls, Dart was convinced that this was evidence of human accumulation of the bones. More than that, he said no carnivore ever accumulates bones. He had had assistants who'd gone out and tried to see whether, in fact, leopards and hyenas brought bones to one place, and they'd never seen this. So that was, again, evidence that this must be human. Have the next slide, please. Now, my own research has been involved to some extent in trying to resolve this problem, because I've never found it convincing, and a lot of other people haven't either, that those bones at Makapanskat or the other sites, other Manape sites in Southern Africa, were in fact brought there by people. There are no stone tools, for example, at Makapanskat. Not a single stone tool. The other sites, by and large, don't have stone tools with the Australopithecines either. Or where there are stone tools, they occur very late in the sequence, after the Australopithecines were already accompanied by later kinds of people, and where it might be that the later kinds of people made the stone tools. Now, what we're looking at here is a niche in rock near Cape Town. This area in shadow is a kind of cutting into rock near Cape Town. The rock here is not very old. It's nowhere near as old as Makapanskat, nor is the infilling. We're only talking about a site that's perhaps 40 or 50 or 60,000 years old. Have the next slide, please. You see, I hope the relevance of this moment. Here you are inside that niche. You see this nice kind of bedding here. That's dune rock. That's, in fact, calcified dune, cemented dune. And then you see this strange sort of thing here. That's a gully that was cut into this dune perhaps 40 or 50 or 60,000 years ago. And in that gully, there are lots and lots of bones. Almost all these points here are bones. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, here you have a close-up. You see these things? These are all bones. All those white spots are bones. Now, this site is known as Swartklip. I hesitate to give you the name because the names can get very confusing in these Afrikaans names. Swartklip near Cape Town as opposed to Swartkrans, which is an Australopithecine site near Johannesburg. This is not an Australopithecine site. This site is Swartklip. It's much, much later. But it's very interesting because there are no stone tools here. The site is somewhere, I can't be precise on the age. We know it's more than 40,000 years old because we can date it with radiocarbon, and it's older than 40,000. It's somewhere between 40 and 100,000. And probably, I would guess, 50 to 60, something like that. Anyway, there are no stone tools here, and yet in this time range in Africa, and certainly in this immediate area, people were making stone tools by the tens of thousands at sites where they were accumulating bones. So it doesn't look like this is a human site. What's more, in these deposits, in addition to these bones, there are fossil dung, what we call coprolites, of hyenas. And almost certainly this is a hyena accumulation. I would bet almost anything on it. Additionally, it's now known that in fact hyenas do accumulate bones in their layers. This has now been observed. Dart assistants didn't observe it, but people have observed it. Both the brown hyena and the spotted hyena have been seen to do this. Well, when I saw this site, it occurred to me that you could perhaps dig out a lot of these bones. You could analyze them in detail and see how they compare to the Makapanskat ones. Can I have the next slide, please? Here you're looking at Swartklip here and Makapanskat there. And these are the frequencies by which different bones are represented of antelopes. So there are 178 antelopes represented by the lower jaw at Makapanskat and 105 represented at Swartklip. But it's not the absolute frequencies, the absolute numbers that I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is the relative frequencies of the different bones. So you've got the most common one at the top and the least common one at the bottom. The most common bone at Swartklip is the mandible, the least common is the ribs. And roughly the same picture at Makapanskat. Sure, there's some differences. The differences, in fact, I think I could explain fairly easily. The differences are partly due to different ways of counting. What I would love to do would be able to go back and recount the Makapanskat bones. Maybe someday I'll be able to do that. And there's now a much bigger sample than was available then. Their counting methods were different than mine, and it wasn't possible to make them exact, make the numbers exact. Additionally, the actual antelopes that are represented at Makapanskat are not quite the same as the ones that are represented at Swartklip. The sites are perhaps 2 million years apart in age, among other things. But given the differences that would almost certainly have existed between the sites, the pattern of body part representation, the most frequent from the most frequent to the least frequent body part, as represented on a graph like this, is remarkably similar. Similar enough so that, well, certainly we know from all sorts of evidence that you do get these kinds of discrepancies, that you can have only 2 animals represented by ribs and 105 represented by lower jaws. And it doesn't have to mean human activity. This site proves that, and there's other evidence for that as well. And I would say that while this kind of resemblance between the body parts at Swartklip and those at the different skeletal elements at Swartklip for the behavior of the Australopithecines from any of these sites. I mentioned the stone tool problem a moment ago. At 2 of the sites, Sterkfontein and Makapanskat, they're the 2 which have perhaps provided most of the Australopithecine fossils. In the deposits that contain Australopithecines, there are no stone tools at all. At one site, where there are stone tools with Australopithecines, the Swartkrans site, the same deposits also contain remains of a more advanced kind of human being belonging to the genus Homo. And it's probably true that it was Homo that made the stone tools. I would say almost certainly. So we not only don't have any reason to suppose that the Australopithecines brought bones to these sites, but there's no evidence that they were doing anything around them. They probably were just the victims of some other carnivore. Now, if we move upwards in time, somewhere probably between 1.5 million and 1 million years ago, one of the kinds of Australopithecines, and I believe there were 2, this is a matter of ongoing debate, but I think there were at least 2 different kinds, clearly 2 different kinds, I think, represented in these South African sites and in East Africa. One of those evolved into something more advanced kind of human being, belonging to the genus Homo, which we belong to as well, and more particularly probably to the species Erectus, Homo erectus, like Peking man and Java man. That's when the archaeological record, it's with the appearance of the genus Homo in southern Africa, perhaps as much as 1.5 million years ago. That's when the archaeological record is reflected in stone tools, in particular, becomes fairly rich. And we find lots and lots of stone tools in sites that are younger than 1.5 million years old. And I'm going to show you one of these sites now, one of what I think is a very exciting site. Probably this one is not as old as 1.5 million. I would guess the things here are probably in the vicinity of 500,000 to 1 million years old. You can see the sea out there. We're now, again, not very far from the Langebaan site, not very far from Cape Town, only about 80 miles north of Cape Town. The site is this patch of sand here. We're going to go down into it in a minute. This is obviously taken from the air. The site is known as Elandsfontein. It's famous in lots of ways. Sometimes it's known as Saldanha because nearby is a town called Saldanha, and there's a skull from the Elandsfontein site which is known as the Saldanha skull. It tells us in the most direct way possible what the kinds of people who lived in this area perhaps 500,000 or more years ago looked like. And they look like Homo erectus. At least that's my opinion, like Peking man and Java man. I'm more interested, of course, in what they were doing than what they look like. Next slide, please. Here you are on the ground approaching the site. Remember that the area, you could see in the last slide, that the area around the sand patch was very heavily vegetated. Here you see the vegetation, but then there off in the distance you see something that looks like a little bit of the Sahara, these dunes rising up like this. Nobody knows how this little patch of sand began to form, when the wind erosion that gave rise to it began, probably only about 20 or 25 years ago. And the farmer who lived in the area drove his tractor into this patch of sand one day. It's about 2 miles long by 1 mile wide. And suddenly he saw that in the areas between the dunes, what we call bays between these huge dunes, there were vast quantities of fossils. He called this to the attention Professor Ronald Singer, who was at that time at the University of Cape Town. He's now a chairman of the anatomy department at the University of Chicago. And Professor Singer came out here with students from the University of Cape Town, it wasn't very far, and they collected vast quantities of fossils, among which, in the very second year, actually, of their work here, was a human skull of the kind that I think belonged to people like Peking Man and Java, also well known in East Africa now, or reasonably well known, and in North Africa. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Here you're inside the dune patch. Sorry, the slide's a bit dirty. You see here the vast dunes rising on all sides, and then this patch in between the dunes. It's a kind of hard surface. The wind can't get down below it. And there are many of these spots that you're seeing here are bones, and in addition to bones of animals, and occasionally human beings, there are vast quantities of stone tools here, particularly the things that are called hand axes, Acheulean hand axes. And there's no question, but most of the bones at this site, unlike the Australopithecine sites, most of the bones at this site are related to human activity. People were killing animals here, probably around water holes, in large quantities. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, closing the door. You're going to see one of the animals they killed. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. What you're looking at here is the skull of an extinct buffalo. These are the horns. Here's one here, going across the forehead and going out like that. And the skull here, just lying in the sand, other bits of bone lying around it. I couldn't find, when I looked at this at home, I couldn't find a stone tool in that picture, but there was one at one point. The distance from here to here, from one end of one horn to the next, is 14 feet. So that had quite a horn span. The animal weighed about, as an adult, probably weighed about 4,000 pounds, about 2 tons. Pretty good sized buffalo. This is a very common animal at this site. Very often, there are stone tools scattered around, and the body parts, the various parts of the skeleton, are disarticulated in a way that suggests butchering. There are a lot of bones which have marks from stone tools on them. And there's no question in my mind that by this time, people were active big game hunters. The bones here very definitely relate to human activity. I might point out something else here, too. This site, as I say, is perhaps 500,000, perhaps a little more, years old. The number of different kinds of carnivores at this site is exactly the same as the number that exists in the area, or existed in the area historically. In other words, by this time, by 500,000 years ago, people were very much in the meat-eating business, and at least as I look at things, following up on ideas that I mentioned earlier, and the number of carnivores had been reduced to about the point where it was historically. The number of prey animals was also about the same as the modern situation. All right, we have other sites like this in southern Africa. This is perhaps the most spectacular one. They seem to range, these things with hand axes and occasionally with animal bones, between about, let's say 200,000 years ago and 1.5 million years ago, with this one right in the middle of that. Well, I would like to say that we have a lot more information about them than we do. We don't, for example, know whether in southern Africa, whether these people built structures at any of these sites. There's some evidence for this in East Africa, but I think it's been tenuous. Probably they did. They probably built windbreaks or shelters of some sort. The chances of finding these things in the archaeological record are pretty slim, I'm afraid. They wouldn't have been all that substantial. They wouldn't have much archaeological visibility. They lived in caves. Presumably the caves provided them with shelter as well. And many of the sites, particularly in the caves, they went back time after time after time, and they built up vast deposits of hand axes. There's another site near Cape Town with several meters, perhaps as much as 7 or 8 feet of hand axe deposit, or 7 or 8 feet minimum on the exposed profile. If you could go down further, I suspect it'd be something like 15 to 20, with hand axes coming out of the deposit. And that must indicate a very long period of occupation, perhaps tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. In the case of the caves, it's easy enough to understand why they came back time after time, because the caves provided shelter. At a site like this, they probably continued to come back because the animals were coming here to drink and they were killing the animals. At other sites, it's not so clear. We sometimes find sites, and they have these in East Africa as well, where the hand axes form literal carpets. You can't walk without stepping on a hand axe. And what brought people back to the site so often that they left these hand axes behind by the tens of thousands isn't always clear. I don't have any good answer for it. Next slide, please. Now, again, another map. We were looking here. This is the site we just looked at, Elandsfontein. There's the town of Saldanha right there, not very far away, which is why the site of Elandsfontein is sometimes known as Saldanha. I'd like to call your attention to a couple other locations while I have this map on here. One is the site of Clossies River mouth, right here, which I'm going to be talking about. That's about 400 miles east of Cape Town. Here's Cape Town right here. Another is Nelson Bay Cave, right where the microphone is there. And then the site of Danafontein, right here. Fontaine is just an Afrikaans word for spring or fountain. Elandsfontein means Eland Spring. Danafontein means Dune Spring. Again, another dune site. I'm going to talk about Danafontein for a couple minutes. Can I have the next slide, please? Moving ahead in time, this is the city of Cape Town. You're looking over downtown Cape Town here. You see these dunes across the bay. I hope you can. I realize the slide is not as good as it could be. See these dunes over here on the Atlantic Ocean side of Cape Town. I was doing some work. I was living in Cape Town, mainly working in the museum in downtown Cape Town, the South African Museum. Cape Town is a modern city of 1 million or so people. Looks like an American city, actually, more than like a European one. You can see the skyscrapers in the background. And on weekends, for relaxation, we would get in a Land Rover and drive out to that area of dunes there. It was known that there were bones lying in the sand there, very much like there were at Elandsfontein, between the dunes. And we hoped that if we went out there often enough, that maybe one day we'd strike it lucky and we'd actually find the bones in a situation where we could excavate them, not just lying on the surface, but still sealed in by dirt, by deposit, by sand. And that hope was realized. It was a rather remarkable thing. It was an incredible piece of luck. Have the next slide, please. Here we are now, over in that patch of sand, only about 30 miles north of Cape Town on the other side of the bay. See the white cover sand that you were looking at before. They're building a new nuclear power plant at this place, and they've spent $1 billion on this nuclear power plant. And in the process, or in preparation, they put in several bulldozer trenches to get an idea of what the underlying deposit was like before they put in the reactor. Seemed like a wise idea. And walking into one of these bulldozer trenches one day, I saw a line of stones and bones sticking out of the wall. We dug into this and found that these things were definitely in place. And this is a later excavation designed to learn something more about the site. Can I have the next slide, please? Here you see some bones in place at this site. There's a lower jaw, actually both halves of the lower jaw of a large buffalo, and this is one of its vertebrae in between. See another part of the jaw, actually, of one of these jaws that's been moved as much as 1 meter away, perhaps roughly 3 or 4 feet away. Another bit of bone there, that's a piece of pelvis of an animal. And then this isn't actually the best slide to show. People who have had some experience with archaeological excavations may wonder what I was doing with a crowbar, and so forth. But anyway, it's not as neat as I might like it. But it's a very exciting sort of thing. We were actually able to excavate here bones that date back probably about 200,000 years. There were stone tools, and unfortunately not clearly exposed in this picture. There is one down there, but it's hard to see in this slide. Stone tools scattered in and amongst these bones. And again, this is one of these sites where people were presumably killing animals that had come down to drink near water. It's a little bit more recent than the last site we looked at. By this time, they'd stopped making hand axes. By, say, 200,000 years ago, they weren't making hand axes anymore. And this seems to be true all over Africa now, so far as we can establish. Okay, have the next slide, please. Now, in terms of trying to get an idea of change through time in the way in which human beings have dealt with animals in southern Africa, it's really the last 125 to 130,000 years that we know best. We have a very substantial record, and that's because we have a lot of very nice cave sites that date from this time interval, where we have long sequences of deposit that in some cases span nearly the entire 125,000 years. This is one such sequence, or one such place that has a sequence like that. This is the Clossies area, Clossies site complex that I pointed out on the map, about 400 miles east of Cape Town. Lots of caves. This is called Clossies 1, and the one I'm sitting on top of it is called Clossies 2. And these are fantastic sites. I'll tell you a little bit about what's been found here. I didn't do the excavation here. The excavation here, again, was done by Professor Singer at the University of Chicago with John Weimer from Britain. My contribution to this project was studying the animal bones. Now, the food debris are very interesting. Among other things, this is the oldest evidence at this site, in anywhere in the world, for use of seafoods. Now, that may sound strange, but we have other sites, older sites, that were located either near a sea coast or on a lake shore, sites that are older than this site, older than 130,000 years. And in all of those sites, the most evidence we have for use of seafoods is maybe an occasional shell or an occasional bird bone, seabird bone, like a gull bone or a fish bone. Nothing that indicates systematic exploitation of sea resources, marine resources. At this site, with dates of about 130,000 years, they're indirect dates, but I think they're solid, and I could perhaps later on explain how we got them. At this site, people were accumulating large numbers of shells. They were actually building up middens of shells. They were killing large numbers of seals and large numbers of penguins. No question, but when they were at the sites, they were utilizing the resources of the sea nearby. And the coast is practically where I'm standing in relation to the slide. Very, very nearby. Okay. Now, there's some other interesting things about this, however. We have deposits here dating back, as I say, to 130,000 years. The record is, in fact, fairly continuous from about 130,000 to about 50, and then it sort of drops off and you have to pick it up at other sites. At sites that are in the same kind of geographic situation, but much, much younger, within, say, the last 10 to 12,000 years, of which we have lots. There's an interesting contrast between the way in which people in the last 10 to 12,000 years used the same resources and the way these people did, say, 130 to 50,000 years ago. I mentioned that these people 130, 50,000 years ago were bringing back shells, they were catching seals, they were catching penguins. But there's some things missing. There are no fish. And there are no bones of flying birds. And flying birds, seabirds, gulls, cormorants, albatrosses, things like this, are very common on the coast today. Additionally, these bones of flying birds and of fish are very common in sites that are, say, in the last 10 or 12,000 years. This suggests to me that people living here 130,000 years ago or so were, sure, exploiting marine resources, but not anywhere near as effectively as people who lived in the area much more recently. Now, we have a problem. We'd like to know, of course, when did active fishing and fouling, if I can use that word, going after flying birds, when did this come about? Well, it's a very difficult thing to establish because I'm sure that those of you who are familiar with the last 130,000 years of climatic history know that much of that period of time, beginning perhaps 65 or 70,000 years ago and running to 10,000 years ago, was a period of enormous increase in the ice sheets in the northern hemisphere, great glaciers, most of Canada covered, sometimes by ice up to 2 or 3 miles thick. That water came out of the sea and the sea level fell. And if you went to this site, if you could have been there 50,000 years ago, the coast would have been 30 or 40 miles away. And of course, in deposits that date between, let's say, 40, 50,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, there's no trace whatsoever of the sea being nearby because it wasn't. People couldn't bring back marine resources when this, well, they could have, but it's unlikely that in their daily round they would travel 30 miles to the sea and bring back seals or penguins or fish or anything. So it's very difficult. We cannot establish when active fishing and fouling came about in this area, simply because the relevant sites are probably underwater. They're out there on the continental shelf and were submerged when the sea level rose again, beginning, say, 10 or 12 or 14,000 years ago when the glaciers began to melt. All we know is right now that sometime between, let's say, 60,000 or 70,000 years ago and 10 or 12,000 years ago, there was a major cultural change, a major advance in the ability of people to deal with marine resources, and they began fishing and fouling. Interestingly enough, in much more recent sites, ones that date from, say, the last 10 to 12,000 years, when sea level was back up high, and between, there were two periods we're talking about here when sea level was high, one between about 130,000 and 70,000, that's known as the last interglacial, and then the last 10 or 12,000 we can call the present interglacial or Holocene. These are the two periods of high sea level. Okay. In the present interglacial, in deposits that date from the last 10 or 12,000 years, we actually have the artifacts that were used for catching fish and birds. We have double pointed toothpick-like things, which were tied to the end of a string. We have ethnographic evidence for this. And then you could either, you put a bit of bait on and either a bird or a fish would swallow it. That's how you caught them. There's no artifacts like that in these older deposits. In the younger deposits, the ones that are 10 to 12,000 years, we have sinkers too. Either line sinkers, bits of rock with a nice sort of groove around them, which were used either to sink lines or to sink nets, again to catch fish. We don't have such things in deposits of 130 to 70,000 years ago. So the technology to do fishing and fouling is very clear in the last 10 to 12,000 years. It wasn't present 130,000 years ago. Now, there's some other things that are very interesting about the animal remains from these sites, this site and later sites, contrasts in particular. When we look at the terrestrial animals, the land-living animals that came out of this site, Possum River mouth, the most common animal is the eland. And the least common animals are pigs, the African wild pig, the bush pig and the warthog. Now, that's a very strange thing because there is no environment in Africa today, much less the one that was historically here, where eland are very common and wild pigs, African wild pigs, are very uncommon. So this, you look at this fauna and you think something's very strange here. And of course, you can also look at the animal remains that come out of much later sites, ones that are, say, younger than 40,000 years. In sites that are younger than 40,000 years, in the same area, same geographic setting, eland are very uncommon and pigs are very common, much more like you'd expect it to be in terms of what was actually running around in the environment, animals on the hook. You would expect more pigs and less eland. What's going on before 40,000 years at a site like this? Why is there so much eland and so few pigs? Well, not a lot of people, there are a lot of people who disagree with my thinking on this, but if you know anything about African large animals, if you were going out to hunt yourself and you were arranging the animals on some kind of continuum from the most ferocious when attacked to the least ferocious, the most ferocious would probably be the pigs among the more common prey, and the least ferocious would be eland in terms of their response to the hunter. And what I think is involved here is I think that people living before 40,000 years ago, certainly before 50 or 60 and back to 130,000, perhaps beyond that, were not as capable hunters as people living this side of 40,000 years. And therefore, they were not able to deal with the most dangerous prey in the environment. Now, what could have happened 40,000 years ago that could have made the change? 40,000 years is a very important date, 40 or maybe as much as 50. It's hard to be precise in that time. We're right at the edge of the limit of the radiocarbon techniques, and so we have a difficult time coming with precise dates. But 40 to 50,000 years ago, something very important happened in this area. We get this change in the animals, in the kinds of animals that we're dealing with. Also, we get a change in the cultural materials. It's at 40 or maybe 50,000 years we get the first art objects appearing in sites. We get the first really nice-looking bone tools. So obviously a very significant cultural change. And I think that with this cultural change, we're probably going to find out that we also get the first modern people. Unfortunately, the actual human fossil record is very poor in the last 130,000 years. We know that by at least 10 to 12,000 years ago, we're dealing with modern people. There's no question about that. But beyond 12,000 years, it's a blank. We have the stone tools, we have the animal bones, but we don't have any really good human fossils. But I would bet anything, because the situation, the picture is very similar in Europe, that roughly 40,000 years ago, modern people moved into this area with a very different culture, and they began doing things in modern ways, like catching fish, like catching flying birds. And additionally, these modern people probably had weapons, perhaps bows and arrows and so forth, projectiles that made it possible for them not to have to get very close to dangerous animals. Maybe they dug pits, who knows. They were able to do things, hunt in a way that allowed them to deal with the most dangerous animals in the environment. Things that, with animals that the people who preceded them, beyond 40,000 years ago, couldn't deal with effectively. Now, it's just a kind of hypothesis, which I'd love to be able to prove someday. Maybe when we get the more sites, we get some decent human remains, we'll be able to say more about that. Have the next slide, please. Now, we get lots of animal bones out of these sites. I've already referred to them. Just a couple quick points here, because I have a tendency to talk too long, and I think I could probably cloud your minds without any problem. But if I can point to what this says up here, small bovids, small medium bovids, large medium bovids, large bovids, very large bovids, obviously there's an increase in size moving in that direction. The animals are getting larger. And these diagrams are very similar to the diagrams that I showed you before. Different kinds of body parts and the number of animals represented by the different body parts. 54 small bovids. Bovids are the general term for antelopes and buffaloes and things like that. Small ones are things that would only maybe stand 12 to 20 inches off the table. Small medium ones are ones that might stand as much as 3 feet, and so forth. Up to large ones, the very large ones here are the giant buffalo that you saw a skull of before, which probably was well over 7 feet, or close to 7 feet at the shoulder, a big animal. So they're divided that way. And the purpose of this slide is simply to show you that the different kinds of body parts, as among these different sized antelopes, are represented very differently. You don't get the same pattern of representation. Now, if I take more time, the explanation for this, and I have to get into it in more detail to make it convincing, the explanation is that the small animals are getting back to the site's whole. This is from this Clausius River mouth site. This is material that is perhaps between 70 and 130,000 years, but it doesn't really matter. It's the same. This kind of thing is the same right through time. The small animals get back to the site whole. People bring back and kill an antelope that stands 1.5 feet off the ground, only weighs 25, 30 pounds. They throw it over the shoulder and they take it home and they eat it there. And what happens to the bones of the animal, the reason some are more common than others is because in the process of butchering and eating, some bones are destroyed and others are preserved. The larger animals, on the other hand, are being butchered where they're killed. And we saw the Dana-Fontaine site a moment ago, which is a place where buffalo were killed and certain body parts were taken away, perhaps to a site like this, perhaps to a cave site, which was a home base site like this. And you get a very much different body part representation for that reason. In fact, if you looked at this list in detail, you'd find that with these animals, the large so-called bovids, which are the ordinary buffalo and eland, and the very large bovids, which are the giant buffalo, that the only body parts which are very commonly represented are head bones and foot bones, and almost everything else is very poorly represented. And that's because those are the bones, for one reason or another, that people chose to bring back to sites most often. Can I have the next slide, please? Here I'm trying to make this point about the difference between a site where the animals are killed and the difference and a site where people were living and bringing back the bones of animals they killed. Here's the Clausius site that we were just talking about a few moments ago, 130,000, 120, or to 70,000 years ago, roughly, in terms of the bones that are on here. Dates don't matter very much. These are, in fact, a bunch of American Indian sites. All the other sites represented here. The bars, again, are the numbers, represent the numbers of bones by which animals of comparable size are represented. The American Indian sites, it's bison, but the bison is about the same size as the buffalo and the eland represented up there. The American Indian sites are of two kinds. Here's one that's a kill site where bison were killed. It's called the Casper site. let's see, where's Casper site's in Wyoming, isn't it? Yeah. And then a series of other sites which are mainly in the Dakotas, bison sites. And here's, say, the Clossy site in South Africa. Now, there are a lot of differences between the patterns, and they are obvious differences. But there's one very strong similarity. At the Clossy site and at all the sites but the Casper site, and all these other sites are like Clossy's in that they're places where people lived rather than where animals were killed. The extent of discrepancy, the extent of difference between the least common bone and the most common bone is very, very marked. You have a lot of bones that are very well represented and a lot of bones that are very poorly represented. Lots of long bars and lots of short ones. And that's generally true of a site where people were living. And the reason for that, as I say, is because at a site where they were living, they weren't bringing back all body parts. They were only bringing back some bones, the ones that they wanted for one purpose or another. Most bones are being left at the place where the animal was killed. At a kill site, on the other hand, the tendency is for all the bars to be much closer to one another in length. You don't get such great discrepancy, so many long ones and so many short ones. It's a very nice sort of thing that you can use if you have any kind of question. If you have a particular site and you're trying to decide whether it was a place where animals were killed or a place where people were living. Sometimes, of course, they can do the same thing, both. They can kill animals and then sit down there and camp there and eat them. But most of the time, they make a distinction. At least in the archaeological record, the distinction is fairly clear between the two kinds of sites. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm going to close up by showing you pictures of a site that I excavated in 1970 and 1971, the first site I excavated in South Africa, which, among other things, is in a spectacularly beautiful setting. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I found there. It's located on the Indian Ocean. Most of the sites we've talked about so far are closer to the west coast of Africa, to the Atlantic coast. This is on the south coast, the Indian Ocean coast. This is a peninsula here called the Robert Peninsula. It's about 2 miles long, tip being there and the headland being over here. And I excavated a cave that was located, unfortunately, I couldn't get a good picture of the cave itself. It's right on the other side. Have the next slide, please. Here you're on the other side of the peninsula looking down it. And it's an unbelievable place in terms of sheer scenic beauty. You're standing at the mouth of the cave that I excavated, looking down. There's another big cave, which you can perhaps just see there. And in fact, there's several caves here, and they have very nice deposits in them. Have the next slide, please. Here you're now looking at the cave. It's a long slit-like affair. In fact, this distance is only about 6 feet from here to here. But in fact, if you were to take away all the deposit that's built up in the mouth, the distance from here down to the rock below is about 60 feet. So a lot of deposit in this site. Most of it is shell. And you can see some of the shells that we carried out of the cave down here on the slope. Shell deposit builds up very rapidly. People bring back shellfish and they can build up several feet of deposit in just a few thousand years. So you can get a very rapid buildup of deposit. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, these got out of order. Well, let's leave this one for the moment. Let me tell you a couple of interesting things about this site. Among other things, I'd like to make one point with this slide on right away. When you had these periods of great ice sheet growth in the northern hemisphere, and there wasn't very much in the way of ice sheet growth in the southern hemisphere. Most of the water that left the oceans went into ice sheets in the northern hemisphere. But you still had this effect in the southern hemisphere, of course, of sea level lowering. That was worldwide. And you see this dark line here. That's the modern coast up there, and behind it the landmass which is spotted. You see this dark line here. That's the last glacial coastline. That's the coastline at about 18,000 years ago when the ice sheets were at their maximum. We know that it's been established by bathymetric work. They've actually done the underwater mapping, topography to show this. What's more, they've dredged up oyster shells off this coastline. It's a very marked kind of niche in the continental shelf. It was a cliff of sorts 18,000 years ago. And they've dredged up oyster shells in relation to it, and oysters grow very near sea level, and these shells dated about 17 or 18,000 years. And we know that 17 or 18,000 years ago, on other evidence, was the time of greatest growth of the glaciers in the northern hemisphere. Here's the site, Nelson Bay Cave, here, right on the coast today. You saw the coastline. That's 50 miles. Now, obviously, that makes a great difference in the life of the people who live there, what the glaciers are doing in the northern hemisphere, and therefore what the sea levels do. If you look at the deposits in Nelson Bay Cave that are older than 12,000 years, there's no indication whatsoever that people were using seashells, seals, penguins, fish, or anything. And of course, the reason is that the coast was too far away. By about 12,000 years ago, the glaciers had begun to melt significantly. The coast was probably, roughly in here somewhere, no more than, say, 8 to 10 miles from the cave, 12 at most. And then you get the first appearance of shells, fish, whatever in the site. By 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, the sea level was about where it is right now, and the deposit is mostly shells. People were using the site basically as a place to catch and eat shellfish. Now, that's kind of an aside. It bears on earlier points. The most interesting find I think I made at Nelson Bay Cave, and it's now been confirmed at a variety of other sites, is that there were a series of animals which lived in this part of the world more than 10,000 years ago, which did not survive into the present. In fact, did not survive younger than 10,000 years. And they include a whole variety of weird and wonderful things, like that giant buffalo that weighed 2 tons, more than twice the living African buffalo. There was a giant hartebeest-like animal, which was as big as a buffalo. And there were a whole series of other animals, perhaps as many as 7 or 8 different kinds of animals that became extinct 10,000 years ago. And this kind of thing, of course, goes on in America as well, and in Europe. In America, it's particularly clear-cut. We have a very dramatic wave of extinctions of large animals, roughly 10, 12, 14,000 years ago. And there's been a controversy in America, in the United States, as to whether people played a role in this. There are a lot of archaeologists who believe that people only arrived in the United States 10, 12, 14,000 years ago maximum, and that their impact in disrupting the ecological equilibrium, not necessarily in killing every animal that they saw, but just in coming in, becoming a new predator, occupying a niche that was sort of there for them all the time, but had never been occupied before. That in doing this, they caused the extinction of all these large animals. And then there are a very large number of people who don't think that that played much of a role at all. And we argue back and forth all the time about why these animals became extinct in the United States. Now, here, it seems to me, I've got some evidence. This is Africa, and of course, people who've been in Africa, we've already been talking about it for 3 million years, or more, at least in this part of Africa. Certainly in East Africa for much more than 3 million years, but this part for at least 3 in Southern Africa. And so you can't argue that it's the first appearance of people 10,000 years ago that had anything to do with the extinction of these large animals. But I still think that people played a very important role. Now, I'll close on this. Let me make a couple points here. 10,000 years ago, of course, was a period of marked environmental change. I've already mentioned that that was a time when the ice sheets were melting significantly, sea level was rising. There were also very important changes in temperature and in precipitation patterns, and therefore in vegetation. The vegetation of this area today, can I have the next slide, please? I think I brought a slide to show you. Yeah, here's the vegetation of this area today. It's forest. This is taken along the side of the road. It's hard to get a picture of a forest, but it's big trees. It's like the forest of Northern California. Can I have the next slide? You go back beyond 10,000 years ago, and that's what it looked like, grassland. Very clear in terms of the vegetational evidence we have, and especially in terms of the animals we represent. So at around 12 to 10 to 8,000 years ago, there was a very substantial amount of environmental change here. Most of the animals that became extinct in this part of the world 10,000 years or so ago were animals that were basically grassland animals. So of course, with the change from grassland to forest, to the modern forest, they would have become less numerous. They had to, because their living conditions would not have been as fortunate for them. But we know that the same kind of environmental change from grassland to forest occurred 125,000 years ago, during the period of time when we were moving from the glacial before last into the last interglacial. We've had these periods of environmental change in a kind of repetitive fashion occurring many, many times. We had the one that occurred 10,000 years ago, very much the same kind of thing occurred 125,000 years ago. And these same animals that became extinct 10,000 years ago survived that. They survived 125,000 years ago. They got less numerous because the environment presumably was not as favorable for them, but they continued. And then when the glacial conditions came back, roughly 70,000 years ago, they did very well again. So environmental change by itself is not a sufficient explanation for their extinction. If they could have survived the environmental change, the same environmental change 125,000 years ago, it couldn't have made them extinct 10,000 years ago. What then is the explanation? Well, a few minutes ago I was telling you that there's a very great difference between the way in which people 125 or 130,000 years ago exploited animals, their ability to exploit animals, and the way in which people did it 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, we know by 10,000 years ago, with anatomically modern people, people who were ancestral to the local Bushmen and Hottentots of this area. And from the animal remains they left behind on the sites, they were much more effective, much more efficient, big game hunters, fishers, whatever, than were the people who lived there 130,000 years ago. And I think that's the explanation. That 10,000 years ago, we had this environmental change. It reduced the numbers of the animals that became extinct. It restricted their ranges. People living in the area just tried to carry on the way of life they always had. They tried to hunt big game like they always had. But the big game was now very much scarce. We went to a lot of trouble. There were all kinds of things in the grave. The grave was a hollow shaft. You can see it here. It goes down at some depth. And they put these huge rocks on top of the person. Probably they weren't slanted at the time. They may have fallen into the hole. This burial is about 8,000 years old. Very common sort of thing in the last 10 or 12,000 years to bury the dead. They probably were doing it for as much as 20 or 30,000 years before that, but we don't have all that many sites older than 10 or 12,000 years. Anyway, it's from situations like this, of course, that we can get a very good idea of what people look like. This person looked like the modern people in the area, like the people who were called Hottentots when the Dutch arrived. Okay, next slide, please. And then finally, I hope this is visible. Yeah, you can see some things here. I could have perhaps picked a better one, but I always have a hard time when I'm looking through my slides deciding. see these figures here. These are paintings. This, of course, is something else that people have been doing in Southern Africa for a very long time. Most of the paintings, these are on a rock face. And most of the paintings that occur on these open rock faces are probably not very old, probably only a few thousand years old at most, because they're exposed to the elements, and they wouldn't last with such nice colors. I hope you can see these things, human figures and so forth. A whole crowd of people look like they're fighting up there, and some more animal-like figures over here. Most of these things I say are probably not more than a very few thousand years old. But very recently in Namibia, or Southwest Africa, Namibia is the United Nations term, Southwest Africa is what the South Africans call it, there were some slabs of rock actually found in the ground where you could get an associated date in charcoal, and they came out about 28,000 years. People have been painting in Africa for a long time. My own guess is that when the record gets very good, maybe hopefully within my lifetime, it may take a long time, we're going to find out that the painting goes back to roughly 40,000. And then before that they didn't. Now, one of the reasons I guess that is because we have some reason to suppose that's true in Europe. And I think the same thing is going on in Africa. Okay. Well, maybe if I haven't talked too long, I could answer some questions.
Well, thank you very much. There may be some of you who have pressing engagements elsewhere. If you feel you need to go, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, if you have some questions, Dr. Klein is willing to entertain with you.
Yeah, sure.
I noticed there was a preponderance of jawbones